The 15th of May, 1945, 9:30 hours. Glucksburg Castle, 3 kilometers north of Finnsburg, Germany. The morning was clear and cool. Through the windows of the castle, Paul Nitze could see the calm waters of the Finnsburg fjord in the distance, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed Europe for the last 6 years. He sat across from the man who had kept Nazi Germany's war machine running for 3 years, even as Allied bombs rained down on every major industrial city in the Reich. Albert Speer, 40 years old, and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, sat calmly, his hands folded on the table. Despite being a prisoner of war, his posture was perfect, and his expression was composed, almost relaxed. There was no arrogance, no defiance, just a quiet calculation in his eyes. Nitze, 38 years old, was a former investment banker from Wall Street who had transitioned to government service in 1940 when his mentor James Forrestal called him to Washington. Now, he was vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. He had one pressing question, but before he could ask, he needed Speer to trust him, or at least believe that cooperating would serve his interests better than silence. The war in Europe had ended just 8 days earlier, on May 7th, when Germany signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender in Reims, France. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th, and on the same day, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, Hitler's designated successor, had declared a government in Flensburg. But by May 15th, Germany was no more than a corpse, and the Allies were preparing to divide the remains. Nitze's task was to extract valuable lessons from Germany's collapse before it was too late. The United Nations War Crimes Commission wanted Speer tried alongside Goering and other Nazi leaders. But Nitze needed him to talk first. The Pacific War was still ongoing. American bombers were attacking Japanese cities with the same relentless fury they had used against Germany. Tokyo had burned. Osaka had burned. Nagoya had burned. But no one knew whether it would work, whether strategic bombing alone could force Japan to surrender without the nightmare of a ground invasion. Estimates for invading the Japanese home islands predicted up to 500,000 American casualties. Strategic bombing had to work. Nitze needed to understand what had worked against Germany so that the same strategies could be applied to Japan. The Strategic Bombing Survey, established in November 1944 by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and President Franklin Roosevelt, had one simple goal: to assess the effectiveness of strategic bombing against Germany's ability to wage war. Nitze had assembled a formidable team, including economist John Kenneth Galbraith and future U.S. Under-Secretary of State George Ball. But Speer was the key. He had controlled every factory, every supply chain, every labor allocation decision in Nazi Germany, from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow. He knew whether strategic bombing had crippled German production or simply inconvenienced it. Speer, however, was aware of his value. He had watched as other Nazi leaders met grim fates. Some had committed suicide, others were fleeing or being captured. Speer calculated that if he cooperated fully with the Americans, especially if he provided information on Germany's war production, he might be spared from execution. He had been the architect behind the production miracle that kept Germany in the war longer than anyone expected. His name was not as infamous as Goering's or Himmler's, and he had not directly been involved in the atrocities of the Holocaust. Speer believed he could navigate the tricky waters of cooperation without revealing his complicity in the genocide. Nitze recognized Speer's strategy immediately. He saw how Speer leaned in when discussing technical matters related to production, but shut down whenever topics veered toward moral issues. Nitze made a tactical decision: focus on factories, production numbers, and bombing effects, leaving the war crimes questions for the Nuremberg trials. Nitze's job was immediate and narrow: gather the information needed to end the war in the Pacific as quickly as possible, without additional loss of American lives. For 7 days, from May 15th to May 21st, Nitze and his team interrogated Speer for 5 hours a day, sometimes extending the sessions when Speer was especially forthcoming. Each morning, Speer arrived in the same well-tailored suit, calm and cooperative. occasionally offering new insights and documents the Americans hadn't thought to request. He walked them through what he called bombing high school, describing how a nation survives and ultimately fails under total air war. Speer started with the production statistics that had made him famous in Nazi circles. When he took over the Ministry of Armaments in 1942, Germany was producing approximately 15,000 aircraft annually. By 1944, that number had risen to nearly 40,000. Tank and self-propelled gun production had gone from around 4,900 inches, 1,941, to 27,000 inches, 1,944. Ammunition production had more than doubled. Despite the Allied bombing campaign, Germany's war machine had kept producing at astonishing levels. The figures were impressive, but something didn't add up. Germany had been under constant bombardment since May 1942, yet its production had tripled. Nitze needed to understand the discrepancy. Nitze was eager to understand the mechanics behind Germany's ability to increase industrial output by 300% despite constant bombardment. How were they able to keep their factories running while Allied bombers dropped high explosives and incendiaries day and night? Speer, speaking like a professor, explained the defensive measures in great detail. He described how Germany dispersed production by moving key manufacturing processes to small workshops in the countryside, making them harder to target. Some factories were moved underground to converted mines or railway tunnels, providing protection from the bombs. Resources were ruthlessly prioritized, with civilian production cut to zero in order to allocate labor and materials for the war effort. Supply chains were designed with redundancy in mind, ensuring that if one factory was destroyed, others could increase production to fill the gap. Speer also discussed how German engineers had developed more efficient industrial processes under the constant pressure of bombing. Aircraft and tank designs were streamlined to reduce the number of parts, speed up assembly, and make production more efficient. Forced labor, sourced from occupied territories, was another crucial factor. Millions of workers were brought to Germany against their will, to replace the men conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Speer presented it all as a matter of logistics and management, solving the problems through administrative skill and organizational innovation. However, there was no mention of the horrific conditions faced by the forced laborers, the starvation, beatings, and deaths in the factories and camps. Speer simply presented production numbers showing increased output. Then, Speer mentioned a pivotal date. May 12th, 1944. That was the day when 935 American bombers from the 8th Air Force launched a massive attack on German synthetic oil production facilities, the largest raid of its kind. The primary target was the Lunar synthetic oil plant near Meersburg, Germany's largest producer of aviation gasoline. Other major facilities in places like Pitz, Berlin, and Stettin also suffered heavy damage. Speer said that this attack marked a turning point. Before May 12th, Germany had been able to produce enough weapons to meet the needs of its armed forces, despite heavy losses to Allied bombing. But after that date, everything began to unravel. The so-called armament miracle came to an end. Speer explained that the war was effectively lost after that attack, although it would take another 11 months of fighting and hundreds of thousands more deaths before Germany surrendered. Nitze listened carefully as Speer continued, his notes filling with key details. The critical insight was clear: oil and fuel. Without fuel, Germany's war machine could not function. After the bombing raids on oil facilities, Germany's production of synthetic fuel dropped drastically. In April 1944, Germany produced 316,000 tons of aviation, gasoline, and other petroleum products. By July, that number had fallen to 107,000 tons, and by September, it had plummeted to less than 50,000 tons. The attacks on oil production continued, with bombers returning time and again to hit the refineries. German efforts to repair the damage and restart production were met with more bombing raids. Despite their best efforts, the refineries became heavily defended, with anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons trying to protect them. But nothing helped. The American bombers kept coming. By December 1944, Germany's fuel production had collapsed to catastrophic levels. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly effectively. Pilot training had been reduced to dangerously low levels, and new fighter squadrons could not even take off due to the lack of fuel. The famous German jet fighter, the Me-262, which was technologically superior to any Allied aircraft, was produced in significant numbers, but it couldn't be used because there wasn't enough fuel for training or for operational combat missions. Panzer divisions were similarly crippled. Commanders had to choose between using their limited fuel for training or saving it for combat, but often they chose to save it, leaving tank crews with insufficient training and leading to higher losses. This created a vicious cycle of fuel shortages and increased casualties. Speer explained how, during Germany's final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, planners had allocated barely enough fuel for the attacking divisions to reach their objectives. The entire operation relied on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain the offensive. But when that capture failed, and American resistance was stronger than expected, German tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned by their crews. Thousands of tanks, which had been painstakingly built in factories that had survived the bombing raids, were left immobile because there was no fuel to move them. Nitze pressed for more details about other bombing raids, particularly the famous attacks on Schweinfurt, where much of Germany's ball-bearing production took place. He asked if those raids, which had been costly for the Americans, had crippled German production. Speer smiled slightly, as though he had anticipated the question. He explained that ball bearings had never been the bottleneck the Americans thought they were. Germany had stockpiled months of supplies before the raids. When production at Schweinfurt dropped, German engineers simply substituted simpler bearings in some applications and imported bearings from Sweden and Switzerland, circumventing the Allied blockade. While the Schweinfurt raids had certainly disrupted production, they hadn't crippled Germany's war efforts in the way the Allies had hoped. In fact, Speer saw the Schweinfurt raids as a net victory for Germany, costing the Allies valuable bombers and aircrews. Finally, Nitze asked about the effectiveness of attacks on transportation networks, particularly the rail system that moved raw materials to factories and finished weapons to the front lines. Speer admitted that these attacks had become increasingly effective, especially in the final months of the war. By February 1945, Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr region, was completely cut off from its coal supplies. Tanks could not reach the Eastern Front, and raw materials couldn't get to factories. The bombing campaign had severely hindered Germany's ability to continue fighting. Speer noted that transportation attacks had only become truly effective late in the war, after Germany was already suffering from other crises, primarily the fuel shortage, which made movement impossible even when rail lines were intact. Nitze then shifted the conversation to the impact of Allied attacks on aircraft production. Speer explained that aircraft production in 1944 had peaked at 39,870 planes, the highest production of the entire war. Nitze was puzzled how could Germany achieve this when Allied bombers were systematically targeting aircraft factories. Speer's answer was simple but devastating. The factories were dispersed, production was moved underground, and assembly was broken into smaller steps, performed in workshops that were harder to target. The Germans had become incredibly efficient at producing aircraft. But the real problem wasn't production, it was fuel. Speer explained, "You can build all the fighters you want, but if you can't fuel them, train pilots to fly them, or get them to operational airfields, they're useless." Germany had produced thousands of aircraft in 1944 that never flew a single combat mission. They sat idle on airfields or in factories due to the lack of fuel and trained pilots. Building an aircraft took weeks, training a pilot took months, and producing enough fuel required refinery capacity that Allied bombers had destroyed. Nitze was starting to see a clear pattern. Strategic bombing had not failed. It had succeeded, but only where it targeted Germany's Achilles heel oil. Everything else, Speer had found solutions for. Factories could be rebuilt, equipment repaired, workers replaced with forced labor, and production processes streamlined. But oil was finite. Germany had almost no natural petroleum reserves, and relied entirely on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline and diesel. Once those plants were destroyed, there was no alternative. After losing Romanian crude oil supplies in August 1944, Germany was left with only whatever synthetic fuel its damaged refineries could still produce, and that amount was dwindling with every bombing raid. On the afternoon of May 18th, 3 days into the interrogation, Nitze changed the subject. He asked Speer about American industrial capacity. What did the German leadership know about American production before the war? Speer took a moment to answer, choosing his words carefully. He explained that, in the early years of the war, from 1939 to 1941, Hitler and the German High Command had not taken America's industrial capacity seriously. They saw America as weak, divided, and still struggling with the Great Depression. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that America would produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 inches, 1,943, along with 120,000 tanks, German military advisors dismissed these figures as propaganda impossible numbers meant to intimidate Germany and reassure Britain. Hitler believed they were nothing more than exaggerated claims from a weak nation trying to appear strong. But those numbers were not exaggerated. In fact, they were underestimates. By the time Speer took over the Armaments Ministry in 1942, German intelligence reports indicated that American production was far beyond anything Germany could match. Speer requested a detailed analysis of American production capabilities. The results were staggering and terrifying. In 1941, the U.S. produced about 19,000 combat aircraft. In 1942, that number reached 48,000. In 1943, approximately 86,000. And by 1944, around 96,000. These were combat aircraft alone, not counting trainers, transports, and other non-combat planes. Speer paused for a moment, then said the words that would stick with Nitze for the rest of his life. By late 1943, when Speer saw the complete American production statistics, he knew with certainty that Germany had already lost the war, not because of a battle or a campaign, not because of German mistakes or tactical failures, but because Germany's industrial capacity had been dwarfed by America's overwhelming material superiority. There was no strategy, no wonder weapon, no tactical brilliance that could overcome such a massive disparity in production. The war was effectively over, though Germany would continue to fight because surrender was unthinkable, and Hitler refused to accept reality. Speer continued, providing more specific figures. Total American aircraft production from 1,941 to 1,945 exceeded 300,000 planes, while Germany produced about 119,000. American tank and self-propelled gun production surpassed 88,000, while Germany produced about 49,000. The U.S. built around 2,700 major naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships, and submarines, while Germany built fewer than 100 major surface warships. But what truly mattered was the speed at which these weapons were produced. American factories churned out weapons at an astonishing rate. For example, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan produced B-24 Liberator bombers at the rate of 1 per hour, 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, Germany's aircraft production still relied on skilled craftsmen assembling components by hand, whereas American production was based on mass manufacturing principles and assembly line techniques perfected in the automotive industry. Speer told Nitze that he had tried to reorganize German industry using American principles, streamlining tank and aircraft designs, reducing the number of different models, and pushing for standardization. While these efforts did lead to some improvements in production, they were ultimately futile. For every gain Speer made, American production increased by an even larger margin. In 1944, the U.S. produced 96,000 aircraft, while Germany's best year was only 39,000. Speer also pointed out something he hadn't fully grasped until it was too late. America wasn't just producing weapons for itself. Under the Lend-Lease program, America was supplying military equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Free France, and every other nation fighting the Axis. By 1944, American factories were responsible for about two-thirds of all Allied military equipment. Speer explained that German military intelligence had failed to understand the true scale of American production in 1939, when they assessed whether America would be a significant threat. Even after Pearl Harbor, when Hitler declared war on the U.S. in December 1941, German leadership believed that Japan would keep American attention focused on the Pacific. They were wrong. America fought a two-front war and overwhelmed both Germany and Japan simultaneously. By mid-1943, it had become undeniable. The tide of the war had turned everywhere at once. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be built. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was using American supplies to sustain offensives that pushed German forces westward. In North Africa, American forces had landed in Operation Torch, and German and Italian forces were being squeezed between American and British armies. In the Pacific, American carrier production meant that Japan faced a foe growing stronger with every passing month, while Japan's own carrier fleet was being systematically destroyed. Meanwhile, over Germany, American bomber formations appeared in greater numbers every week. The 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force in Italy flew massive daylight raids, targeting key sites with hundreds of heavy bombers escorted by long-range fighters. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to stop them. German fighter production was high, and pilots were initially skilled. New aircraft, such as the Me-262 jet fighter, showed technological superiority over anything the Allies flew. But there was not enough fuel to operate them in sufficient numbers. Even when fuel was available, the overwhelming numbers of American bombers and fighters made the Germans' efforts futile. For every German fighter shot down, the Americans replaced it with multiple new aircraft. German pilot losses, which were never adequately replaced, further worsened the situation. By 1945, Luftwaffe squadrons were sending out pilots with less than 50 hours of flight time to fight seasoned American and British veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. These engagements were not battles, they were massacres. Speer recalled a moment in late 1943 when he considered approaching Hitler with the truth that Germany could not win. He thought about telling Hitler that the sheer scale of American production made victory mathematically impossible, and that the war should end through negotiation before Germany lost all leverage. But Speer lacked the courage to speak those words. Hitler still believed in secret weapons like the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, advanced jet fighters, and new submarine designs that he thought could turn the war in Germany's favor. But Speer knew these weapons wouldn't matter. You can't win a war with technological advantages when your enemy is outproducing you tenfold. Yet, Speer kept this knowledge to himself and continued to keep the factories running. Men kept dying for a cause that was already lost. On May 20th, Nitze asked Speer about Hitler's Nero Decree, the scorched earth order issued in March 1945. With defeat inevitable, Hitler had ordered the destruction of all industrial facilities, transportation, infrastructure, utilities, and anything else of value to the advancing Allied armies. Germany itself was to be destroyed rather than fall into enemy hands intact. Speer claimed he had disobeyed the order. He said he transferred his loyalty from Hitler to the German people and tried to preserve what was left of Germany's industrial capacity for post-war reconstruction. He had sabotaged the implementation of the decree and ensured that critical factories and bridges were not destroyed. While it's uncertain how true this story was, it helped Speer's image and would assist him at his trial by presenting him as a humanitarian who had tried to limit the destruction. He positioned himself as someone who thought about Germany's future, as opposed to the fanatical ideologues around Hitler who wanted to drag the country down with them. On May 23rd, as expected, American and British military police arrested Speer and other members of the Flinberg government. They were taken aboard the ship Patria under the pretense of negotiation, but the Allies had already planned their capture. Speer reportedly said, "So now the end has come. That is good. It was all only kind of an opera anyway." He was transferred through several detention facilities before arriving at Nuremberg, where he would be tried alongside 23 other senior Nazi leaders. Nitze and his team moved forward with their work, compiling their findings into reports. The Strategic Bombing Survey published its conclusions in September 1945, spanning over 200 volumes focused on the European theatre alone. The key findings were clear. Strategic bombing had been decisive in defeating Germany, but not in the way air power theorists had predicted. Attacks on civilian morale had largely failed. Germans endured bombing with remarkable resilience. Cities were destroyed, but factories kept producing. Workers continued to show up for work despite losing their homes, facing food shortages, and enduring everything else the war had thrown at them. Attacks on ball-bearing production, aircraft factories, and other precision targets had achieved limited results. Germany had found ways to work around those losses by dispersing production, building redundancy into supply chains, and substituting materials. However, the systematic destruction of synthetic fuel plants from May 1944 onward had crippled the Wehrmacht. Without fuel, Germany's military effectiveness dropped by around 80% in the final months of the war. Speer's production miracle became irrelevant. You can build tanks and aircraft, but without fuel, they were useless. The survey concluded that the oil campaign had shortened the war in Europe by months, saving countless Allied lives. It demonstrated that strategic bombing could be decisive when targeted at key resources. Nitze applied these lessons to Japan. He was reassigned to the Pacific Strategic Bombing Survey Team in July 1945 and arrived in Nagasaki in September, shortly after the atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He saw firsthand the destruction that surpassed anything conventional bombing had achieved. Interviews with survivors revealed a different form of collapse, one that mirrored Germany's demise. Japan, like Germany, was collapsing under the strain of losing access to critical resources, in this case, raw materials for its industries. Though the mechanisms were different, the principle was the same: modern industrial warfare cannot be sustained without resources, and an enemy with overwhelming naval and air superiority can cut off those resources. The interrogation of Speer would shape American defense policy for decades. Nitze would serve in nearly every U.S. presidential administration from Truman to Reagan, advising on strategic defense, arms control, and nuclear strategy. He helped design the Marshall Plan and was the principal author of NSC 68, the foundational document of Cold War containment strategy. But Nitze never forgot what Speer had told him in May 1945. That modern wars between industrial powers are ultimately won by the side with greater productive capacity. America's ability to outproduce any rival was its greatest strategic advantage. Speer was convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and crimes against humanity, primarily for his use of slave labor in armaments factories. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison at Spandau prison. The tribunal acknowledged his efforts to sabotage Hitler's scorched earth decree and noted that he had accepted personal responsibility for some of the regime's actions, though this was limited to avoid admitting knowledge of the Holocaust. He served his full sentence and was released on October 1st, 1966. He later published 2 memoirs that became international bestsellers, painting himself as the apolitical technocrat who had been seduced by Hitler's charisma but remained fundamentally decent. This narrative, known as the Speer myth, dominated historiography for decades. It wasn't until the 1980 seconds and 90 seconds, when historians gained access to previously hidden documents, that the full truth emerged. Speer had extensive knowledge of the Holocaust, and he had personally expanded Auschwitz. His entire post-war story was a carefully constructed lie, designed to avoid the death penalty and rehabilitate his image. But in May 1945, Nitze didn't know this. He only knew that Speer had provided the Strategic Bombing Survey with the crucial information needed. Speer died in London on September 1st, 1981, at the age of 76, while visiting the United Kingdom. Obituaries portrayed him as the good Nazi, the reluctant war criminal who had tried to mitigate the destruction. These obituaries angered Holocaust survivors and historians who knew the truth. Nitze passed away on October 19, 2004, at the age of 97. His obituary in the New York Times highlighted his role in shaping U.S. Cold War strategy. But it only briefly mentioned the strategic bombing survey and did not mention the key insight Speer had given him about the importance of industrial capacity in warfare. The findings of the strategic bombing survey remain in archives and are occasionally studied by military historians. The lessons on targeting oil influenced air campaign planning in subsequent wars, such as the Gulf War in 1991, where the US targeted Iraq's oil infrastructure, ensuring a more effective strategy. The Vietnam War, however, repeated many of the same mistakes made during World War II, focusing on infrastructure and morale rather than targeting vital resources. Ultimately, it was Speer's own words that revealed the answer to why Germany lost. It wasn't about strategic errors or technological failures. It was because Germany could not match America's industrial output. The U.S. could produce twice as many aircraft, nearly twice as many tanks, and 10 times the naval vessels. Germany had world-class engineering and skilled workers, but none of it mattered when facing an enemy who could produce 5 fighters for every 1 Germany built and replace every sunk ship with 2 more. This was the revelation Nitze carried with him after his time at Glucksburg Castle in May 1945. Strategic bombing wasn't just effective when it targeted oil. It was crucial, but the bigger lesson was about industrial capacity as the backbone of military power in modern warfare. America demonstrated a form of economic power that no rival could match without fundamentally transforming their entire economic system. The Soviet Union understood this lesson well. Stalin's post-war industrial buildup was specifically designed to match American productive capacity. The nuclear arms race, in part, was driven by this understanding. If you can't match America's conventional production, then you develop weapons to offset those numerical disadvantages. Soviet industrial expansion in the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds was an attempt to create a robust productive base capable of sustaining conflict with the US. But it failed. The Soviet economy collapsed in 1991, unable to maintain military spending while keeping up civilian living standards. On the other hand, China learned a different lesson by studying World War II production statistics. Instead of trying to outproduce America through centralized communist planning, China integrated itself into global trade networks, attracted foreign investment, and built manufacturing capacity by becoming the world's factory. This economic growth then funded their military modernization. By 2020, Chinese industrial output surpassed America's in many areas. Whether this translates into military superiority in future conflicts remains uncertain, but Chinese strategists have studied the strategic bombing survey and understand what Speer told Nitze. Wars between industrial powers are won by the side that sustains production longer, replaces losses faster, and brings overwhelming material advantage to bear. The core findings of the strategic bombing survey remain relevant. Target resources that can't be replaced. Understand that civilian morale is much more resilient than pre-war theorists believed. Recognize that industrial dispersal and redundancy can help a country overcome even heavy bombing. But ultimately, modern warfare is a contest of industrial capacity. The side with more factories, more resources, more workers, and superior production systems will win if all other factors are roughly equal. This is the lesson Nitze learned from 7 days of interrogation in May 1945. Germany couldn't win because America's material superiority was mathematically insurmountable. Speer had known this since late 1943, but he kept producing anyway, because stopping meant immediate collapse. But he knew, and when he shared this knowledge with Nitze, it shaped 4 decades of American defense policy. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps others discover these important chapters of World War II history. Subscribe to stay connected with untold stories from the war. Each one reveals something about how the modern world was shaped. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community includes history enthusiasts, veterans, and students from every continent. Thank you for watching, and helping keep these stories alive.